Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on GHS and the GCC. Obviously, at this point, we're still waiting for a couple people to come in, so I'm going to give them another minute or so, but also to be respectful of everybody else's time who was here at 9. I'll start pretty much close to that time at all possible. If somebody could just give me a response in the chat block that you're able to hear and see me and see the presentation, that would help. Because we use the same software all the time, but every once in a while, as you know, something creeps up and a setting gets changed that we're not aware of, and things become certainly challenging. So, Amen and Alyssa, thank you very much for letting me know that. Are you able to see the slide in the center of the screen, the presentation? Excellent, perfect. So we're just going to give everybody another minute to join us, and we'll go ahead and get started. Those of you with possibly one exception should have received the presentation slides in an email about an hour ago. That was actually something that came up in one of the previous webinars we did, where people were saying it would have helped them to prepare questions if they had the information ahead of time. So you should have that now. I think everyone got it. Maybe one person who was a little bit later in joining today didn't get it, but everybody else should have it. And then also, as we'll talk about at the end, the information will be available on our YouTube channel, which is the presentation and also this live audio. So let's take a quick look at all the attendees. We're expecting almost 60, and we've got a fair amount. So let's go ahead and get started this morning. So again, thank you for everybody to attending this webinar, complimentary webinar called GHS and the GCC. My name is Michael Wenk, and for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet before, we'll go into just one slide of background on who we are and what we do. But I want to take the opportunity to say, for those new people, thank you so much for attending. Not quite sure, because so many different ways we try to promote this, that you may have heard about the webinar, and hopefully you find value in it at the end. But this is something we do pretty much once a quarter. We did one, I think, in March. We're doing this one now, obviously, and then we're doing South American regulatory updates in September, and we're going to be doing one at the end of the year on cosmetics in the GCC, or actually cosmetics in the Middle East, which the two tie together, as you'll see as we go through here. So again, you can go to our website, which is www.m4globalconsultingllc.com, and you can find all the events there. You can register, you can find our services, everything in the one-stop shop. We start, just some quick housekeeping rules. If you haven't already, please go ahead and mute your microphone. We will do comments and questions in the chat box. And as I usually tell people, if I don't notice them or I don't get to them all in the time frame we have, I record this so I can always go back and answer those questions to you as a group. So maybe other people have the same question, didn't get a chance to ask it. I will put that out for other people and everybody who's attended to see. Comments in real time, of course. This particular webinar, and actually all of the webinars that we do, are not intended to be exhaustive. And by that, I mean, for example, we talked about the new decree 5971 in Chile, establishing a national inventory and establishing GHS in our last webinar. And that was a 205-page regulation. So obviously we couldn't go into all the details and nuances there. So what we did is we just gave a quick overview, so you know what the regulation says, generally what you need to do, and you know who you can go to if you have questions. That's what we're doing, the same thing here with the GHS and the GCC. There are so many nuances to it that we don't have time to cover them all, but hopefully this gives you an overview. And then if you have further questions, you can certainly ask us, or you can look into the regulation yourself. And then, as I talked about, the recordings and the slides are available. So again, for those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, I'm the president and director of M4 Global Consulting. We were founded in 2009. My background is I come to you with over 25 years, almost 30 years now, in global companies as manager and director roles in regulatory affairs. So I bring, I think, a very unique aspect to it, in which we have the chemical knowledge from the industry. We also have the regulatory knowledge. You know, what are the regulations in the GCC, for example? What are the regulations in Chile? But we also bring the knowledge of me being in industry for that time period, and we can say, yes, we understand the regulations, but here's how it actually applies in industry. Here's how it actually might apply in your company. Because I've worked with these registrations and had to work with R&D, with product development, certainly with marketing when it came to labels and label claims and things like that. Finance, you know, talking about regulations and fees and so on. So I think we bring a very unique background that maybe others don't, in that we can help you talk directly to the key decision makers in your firm, because again, we've been there, we've done that. We can marry the regulations and marry the business side as well. So just some of the things for those of you we haven't had a chance to meet before. We talked about the expertise that we have. We also have demonstrated expertise in Latin America and in the Middle East. And I say that not to be arrogant, but to say that you can see the list here of just some of the things we've done. Other companies have expertise, but maybe they don't have the depth that we do, or they don't have the breadth of expertise that we do. And these are some things we're very proud of, because some of these, for example, the Mexico COVID claims, when COVID first came out in the middle of, I believe it was 2020, getting some class 1 medical devices registered in the Middle East, specifically in the UAE. Those are things, from my experience, a lot of companies don't have the actual hands-on expertise to do. And we're very proud of having accomplished those things. And then, as you see at the bottom here, we are available to operate in 66 countries. And you see some of the aspects that we do: biocides, consumer products, food contact. The majority of those we do ourselves. We have direct experience. We have worked in those industries, in those countries, and we have direct specific ministry contacts, which is something I didn't talk about before, which I think is another value we bring. We don't have to say, for example, in the UAE, if you have a class 1 medical device you want registered, we don't have to say, I think they might have some regulations. Let me call around, see if I can get somebody on the phone, and maybe they know what they're talking about, or maybe I'm in the wrong ministry. We have those specific relations developed. So again, to use that example, if you had a medical device in Bahrain, we know that it is the Ministry of Health, and we know the gentleman at the Ministry of Health who is responsible for the registration of those devices. So we offer that, one, to know who to go to specifically and save you time, but also to save your company resources trying to figure out on their own, well, who is responsible for this? Do we need a registration? What does a registration look like? So again, values that we bring that I hopefully will find useful to you. So going ahead and get started. Looking at the agenda today, it's fairly brief because, as I said, again, it's just an overview at this point. First thing I want to start talking about is an overview of the Middle East chemical regulatory environment. And I think that's useful. I certainly do that when I do South America, but it's also useful for the Middle East because for a lot of people, maybe you haven't worked in that space before, and you're used to how things work in Europe or in Asia Pacific or the United States. And you need to have a somewhat broad, but also somewhat precise understanding of how regulations work in the Middle East in order to understand if they apply to you, and if so, to what degree. So we'll just do a quick overview there. Then we're actually talk about the GCC. What is the Gulf Cooperation Council? What does that mean? Who's involved? What are the requirements for membership? You know, things of that nature that maybe people haven't discussed before specifically. We're going to talk about the GSO, the Gulf Standards Organization. So just when you understand what the GCC is, I'm going to throw another term at you that is the same, but yet also different. And we'll explain what that means as we go through. And then we're actually going to look at the GCC GHS standard, which is GSO 2654 of 2021. And this is actually, I think, something we go into the next slide, but let me just preempt it by saying, when you're looking at the Middle East regulations, here it doesn't necessarily matter that it's a GCC regulation because they're all formatted the same. What you will see is you will see the competent authority generally, so what the GSO in this case, but the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, the authority that has responsibility for that regulation will have their name first. So here, in place of GSO, it would say Ministry of Environment if it was a specific country. Then you would see the 3 or 4 digit, depending, number of legislation or of the final regulation that we're going to be talking about, or that is the subject of whatever you're looking at. So, and then, well, let me finish, then go back to it. And then after the colon, you will see the year that it was passed in. So in this one, the Gulf Standards Organization published regulation. It was the 2,654th regulation that they published in the year 2021. So some of you in the United States, for example, you're used to working with the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. You're working with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. You know that generally speaking, FDA regulations are going to be found in Title 21 of the CFR, and EPA will generally be found in Title 40 of the CFR. You have those groupings by authority or by regulation type. In the GCC and in the Middle East, you don't have that. This, again, just happens to be the 2,654th regulation that was put out in 2021. The 2,653rd regulation might be absolutely nothing to do with GHS. It could do with food. It could do with diesel engines. So you can't necessarily look and say, well, the number means something compared to other regulations because it's simply in numerical order. So I want to stress that as we go through. When we're talking about the Middle East regulatory environment, generally speaking, The Middle East functions on a system of either licenses or permits. So those of you that are familiar with the EU, for example, with REACH or CLP or Asia, K-REACH, things like that, they don't tend to have regulations in the same way. They do have regulations, as we'll see again. They do have a GHS regulation, but they don't normally look that way. Generally speaking, when you go to a country and you want to have a product available for sale, you have to find out, first of all, who the ministry is, who has responsibility. Again, is it health? Is it environment? Is it commerce in some cases? And generally what they will do is they'll say, okay, here's the regulation that we feel applies to you. But what you have to do to comply with it is you have to have us grant you a license or a permit. It's not necessarily enough to say, well, we've read the regulations, we feel we meet all the criteria, therefore we can go ahead. You will often have to have a license or a permit granted, depending what the authority is, for a certain amount of time for certain specific products. So again, don't just say, well, I checked the regulation here and therefore everything's okay, so I'm just going to go to market. You're probably fine in that respect, but you definitely have to make sure you have a license from the authority and or a permit from the authority in order to give that bring that product in a compliant way. The GCC, and we're going to talk about this on the next couple slides, but the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is something that I say loosely, and I want to stress loosely, is similar to the European Union, for example, or similar to Mercosur or the Andean Community in South America. Loosely, it's a group of member states that have decided that they want to join together for various reasons, one of which is free trade, free movement of goods. One is import duties. One is something that they've aspired to, but really aren't anywhere near yet. A single unit for regulatory requirements for a whole host of products. You see that a little bit in the EU with the BPR and then the BPD earlier on. I'm sorry, BPD first, then the BPR. That's something that they're wanting to model to, but they're nowhere near there. So when you think about the GCC, just think about it's kind of a loose organization of certain countries, and specifically not all the countries in the Middle East. You see here, for example, the member countries there, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Those are the members that we will talk about, and those are the members of the GCC. Now, remember, I keep saying just you have to pay attention to all these different things. Just when you think you understand, okay, I understand what the GCC is, I understand how they work with their regulations in the Middle East, you have to be aware that some cities in the Middle Eastern countries, cities specifically, have their own regulatory systems for chemicals. And we're not going to talk about this today, but the example I always give, not talk about it in detail, but the example I always give is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not have a countrywide national chemical regulation, national chemical inventory. So if you come to us or you come to the Saudi authorities and ask that question, we will tell you, no, there's not one in place. It doesn't exist. However, in Saudi Arabia, there are two cities, specifically that have chemical inventory regulations. And we'll be happy to discuss those with you offline, let you know what those are and how they operate. But so again, be aware when you're talking at the country level. Remember I said earlier, well, we meet the requirements of the regulation, we can just bring the product in. Not necessarily, because you may need a license, you may need a permit. Same thing when it comes to cities in the Middle East or countries in the Middle East. Just because there's no national requirement for chemical legislation, chemical inventory, whatever it might be, does not mean that cities don't have those specific regulations. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we touched on it, but they have two cities that have chemical inventory, chemical reporting, chemical notification system, storage requirements, all the things that if you trade in that city or out of that city, you need to be aware of. So we touched about it a little bit before. What is the GCC? So we're not going to belabor it here, but here's again the countries that are involved. And when we talk about the GCC, we are only talking about these countries. So for example, Israel, at least by our designation, is considered to be in the Middle East or Turkey or something like that, depending. They are not subject to GCC regulations because they are not in the GCC. Same way that, you might argue that the UK is now not subject to some of the EU regulations that it was in the past because it's chosen to withdraw from the EU. And I know there's nuances there, but generally speaking. So when we talk about the GSO, now remember the GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's that organization of certain countries in the region. So the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and so on. That's the GCC. When we talk about the GSO, that's something different. That's the Gulf Standards Organization. And basically what the GSO does is the authorities of the various member countries in the GCC got together and said, you know, for different reasons, be they staffing, be they knowledge, whatever it might be, we, the GCC member countries, don't have the knowledge to draft a lot of the regulations that we feel we would like to. For example, you know, we might want to draft, for example, GHS regulation. Let's use that. It's a perfect example. We want to draft a GHS regulation, but we don't have anybody in any of our countries that has expertise that understands GHS well enough and understands, for example, what the requirements, burdens would be for companies operating in our member states that would have to comply with GHS. They don't understand some of the classification processes. They don't really feel comfortable knowing how to classify products or putting out a classification list. So what the GSO is, it is an organization created of all the member states. They've gone together and they've said, okay, let's find a third party who's called the GSO ultimately, who can go ahead and do these technical things for us. So the member states themselves don't put out the regulation and do the background research and so on. They go to a third party and they say, third party, could you please come up with the standard, this regulation in this particular case, that we can have our member states follow, because we simply just don't have the expertise. So they go ahead and do that. An example too, again, we're talking about Saudi Arabia earlier. Saudi Arabia, just as an aside, has SASO. You see here on the slide, SASO. So Saudi Arabia has their own country-specific organization, SASO, that does the same thing as the GSO. So that's, again, where it gets confusing. You think you know something and you say, well, do I know all the regulations involved? Do I know all the requirements involved? Do I know all the players? Do I know all the ministries involved? There, for example, you have to look at two specific regulations or two specific authorities when it comes to that. And I say authorities because certainly in Saudi Arabia and also in the GCC, these organizations, these third parties, function as authorities. They are given authoritative rights by the member states to actually draft them, put them into national law, and to, if need be, to enforce them. Again, it's just the companies or the country saying, we don't have the knowledge and expertise. We want you, third party, to do this. So they go ahead and do that. One of the interesting things looking at the end here, when it comes to the GSO standards, and this is, again, is somewhat to how it's been in Europe historically, when the GSO develops a standard, the implementation of those standards, like GHS, is voluntary in the member states. Now, I say that not to say, well, it doesn't matter, because it does matter. But when the GSO creates a standard for the GCC member states, it says to the GCC member states, here's the regulation you have asked us to put together. Then the GCC member states need to take that and incorporate it into their national law. They need to pass it through their parliament or however their individual processes work and get it passed into national law. So, and that's a voluntary process. Now, when it comes to the GSO and the GCC, generally speaking, because the countries are all involved and they say, yes, we need, for example, a GHS regulation, we're going to go ahead and put that into our national law, but it takes time. So they might pass this, as we'll see here, fairly recently, but then Saudi Arabia, for example, might take, let's just say, 3 years because of different priorities legislatively and different other aspects to get the GHS regulation into Saudi national law. So that's another aspect to take care of, is when you're talking about a GSO standard, you have to see, has the member state already put it into their national law? Because that's a second step. The minute the GSO creates it doesn't mean it's binding, it's voluntary. And again, most of the time they take the regulations and they make them mandatory, but there is that time period. So to say right now, when we talk further about the GHS regulation, because it's so recent, it's not binding in any of the member states in the GCC. However, as we said, they intend to do that, and they're going to implement it. So it will be coming. It's just a question of when it comes. So now we're going to go on and look at the actual regulation, the GSO regulation 2654 of 2021. And the reason we're talking about it now and not in 2021 is because of many things, COVID and other legislative priorities and so on. There was a bit of delay. It was passed in 2021, but there's implementation dates. There are other things going on. So that's why it's dated 2021, not 2022. So as you see here, starting back in October of 2019, the GSO said, here's our first draft, member states. It's called TC01. I think it's Technical Consideration 01. The GSO put it out to member states and says, here's our first attempt at this. What do you think? And they based it on the 5th revision of GHS, because at the time, that was largely what was out, and that was also largely what was being used in various other areas of the world. Then what happened is in January of this year, after the review period and so on, the member states got together and said, okay, yes, we feel comfortable about this. It looks good. We can manage it. They're going to publish it. So the GSO published it, or the GCC, I'm sorry, published it in January of this year. And they call it the GHS regulation, but it's still known by the original number as GSO 2654. Now, again, I'm not trying to confuse you unnecessarily, but again, like we talked about, when it gets passed into national law in the Middle East, that number will change because it will be a national regulation in, for example, Oman. And it might be let's just make up a number. It may be the 123rd regulation put into law in Oman in 2022. So at the GCC level, the number of the regulation would be GSO 2654 of 2021. But again, using what we've talked about, in Oman, the regulation could be 123 of 2022. So again, just not trying to confuse you, just making you aware of all these moving parts that you have to have a good guide to get you through, because things may change that you're not aware of, and they can certainly have an impact on you. So you see the regulation here, the Global Harmonized System in Gulf Cooperation Council countries is the actual formal name of the regulation. The number, as we've talked about, is 2654. The standard applies to, as you see here, all substances and mixtures. So all substances and all mixtures, either supplied, imported, manufactured in the country, or used in the country. So if you use the product, but you don't necessarily, or you don't, let's say, manufacture the product, you still may have an obligation under GSO 2654 to follow the GHS regulation. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. There are more specific, the GHC regulation, though, says if there are more specific classification requirements or more specific labeling requirements than what's given in GSO 2654, the countries are allowed to put those in place of what's in the GSO regulation. So take a step back. What they talked about, again, putting it into national law, for example, in Oman. Oman can put the regulation in, but say, for example, you know what? We want to follow different building blocks of the regulation that are not included, or there are building blocks included in the regulation, but we don't want those. We want to take them out. So the countries have that flexibility. So again, not to confuse you, but the country may say, well, we're going to take most of GSO 2654, for example, and not all of it. And that's something that they absolutely can do, and they have done with other regulations in the past. So again, think of GSO 2654 as an umbrella. This is, what we're giving to you, member states, but the member states can pick and choose from that umbrella what they want to include. So what happens in Oman, for example, may not be the same as what happens in Saudi Arabia when it comes to GHS. And then just looking at the bottom, we have the usual exemptions when it comes to the regulation. Again, this isn't at the GCC level. This is not states, because the states have not put it in yet. Articles are exempted from GHS regulations, but you can give a safety data sheet if you want. It says specifically that you can do that. R&D mixtures and R&D substances, similar to how we see it in other countries, but they're exempt, again, at the GCC level from the regulation. Non-isolated intermediates. So if you work in a manufacturing facility and the product is not isolated from your mixture or your reaction, that doesn't need a safety data sheet. And then, of course, with the catch-all that we see in most other regulations for almost everything that says basically these things are regulated by other statutes or other standards or other regulations, so they don't apply. So cosmetic products, generally speaking, and we'll talk about this at the end of the year in a webinar, are regulated by the individual member states, but cosmetic products do not need to have a GHS format safety data sheet or label applied to them because there are separate regulations that talk about the label requirements that are required in that example. So talking more about 2654, those of you that are familiar with the CLP regulation in Europe, and you'll see this as we go through Middle East in future webinars, one of the things that the Middle East likes to do, because again, they don't have the expertise that ECHA or the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States have, they tend to adopt regulations that are in place in other countries and bring them into their national law. Most of the time, 100%. Sometimes they leave a little bit behind, but generally speaking, 100%. Let's see, Paul, I'll get to that question in a second, just to finish this thought. So Table 3 of Part 3 of Annex 6 of the CLP directive, they have taken that classification list or that list of hazardous substances, and they have brought that in completely into GSO 2654. So if you're familiar with that part of the CLP regulation, nothing has changed. They brought that entire aspect in. It's exactly the same as it is under CLP. And there's a little qualification there. Those of you that work more deeply with CLP, you can see that. So we have a question. If you provide a safety data sheet with, I'm assuming you said I'm assuming GHS classifications that have not been adopted in that country, would it be an issue? I would say no, as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements. If you provide a safety data sheet with GHS classifications that have not been adopted in that country, no, it would not be a problem, because if they haven't adopted, they would look at it as generally extraneous information, extra information. They'd say, well, it's nice that you classified this, acute eye irritant as such, and just saying, potentially, we don't recognize that classification. Thanks for putting it on there, but it doesn't mean anything to us. I think that would be fine. And then same question, Paul is also saying, is it okay to overwarn? Yes, there's nothing in the regulation as it exists now at the GCC level that says you cannot overwarn or overclassify. And now, again, remember, when it gets down to the member state level and they start doing things to it to make it in their national law, that may change. But as of now, no, there's nothing that says there's no penalty, let's say, for overwarning. You can absolutely do that if you so choose. Okay. So give you a sense here kind of how comprehensive the GSO regulation is. And again, if you've worked in other areas of the world, you've certainly seen these formats. This is the scope of the regulation. There are 7 parts to it, and some of the parts have different names, and we'll talk about those as we go through them. Maybe you're used to seeing in other countries of the world. 7 parts plus an appendix. And the interesting thing is we get to it, you'll see the appendix is not really an appendix. It's actually part 8 of the regulation, but they call it an appendix. But when we go through it and you see what's required in it, you'll see it's not truly an appendix the way we're used to thinking, for example, with CLP, like we just saw in the previous slide. It's actually part of the regulation. They just term it an appendix. So when we're talking about the GSO standard, you see all the things here that it applies to. It applies to all the things we touched on a little bit plus more. Production, transport, handling, use, and disposal as materials identified as hazardous. And that's, again, something you will, as we drill down into the regulation, you will see what they consider to be a quote-unquote hazardous material. Mixtures and substances, we talked about that previously. We talked about what it does not apply to, so we won't go through here. This is, again, just to have a more quick summary slide for you when you're going back over the presentation and saying, well, where can I find a quick summary of the things that it does not apply to? Here's that information for you. Some of the things that they've done in the GSO, they have either incorporated former GSO standards or they have just replaced them entirely. So an example here, there was a GSO standard 1810, and I apologize for not putting the year, it was also 2013, called labeling, and then it was labeling of chemical products. Now, as a result of this GHS standard, there is now a GHS standard for labeling of chemical products, according to GHS. So the GSO has decided, well, we don't need GSO 1810 anymore. It's, depending on how you look at it, it's either been repealed because it doesn't exist anymore, or it has been included in the regulation, the GSO 2654 regulation, which will tell you how to label your individual products. So that doesn't exist anymore. And the GSO standard from 2013 about safety data sheets for chemical products, again, gone away because it's been replaced by this GSO 2654. So I'm getting into terms definitions. This is important because remember I said in the beginning when they started talking about drafting this and giving it to the member states for their review, we were talking about the 5th revision of GHS. Here it's using the 7th revised edition, so 2017 is actually the standard that's being used. Now, again, when it goes to the member state level for implementation into their law, they could decide they want to follow the 8th or the 9th or whatever it turns out to be implementation of GHS. But as of now, as it's written, they're following the 7th revised edition. A couple definitions that I want to highlight because I think they're a little bit different than most of us are used to seeing. Talking about a substance, you can see the definition there, but it excludes specifically from the definition of a substance any solvent that can be separated without affecting the stability of the substance or changing a composition of the substance. So, for example, the example they give there is methyl isocyanate is an example of a substance. Now, the bold-faced language is mine to show you, and as we go through, it'll be the same way, to call your attention to something. So if there's a solvent that you can separate off and it keeps the stability of the product and it does not change its composition, then it is not considered to be a substance per the definition in Section 3. A couple things that we're used to seeing, so just putting them there, mixtures, articles. SVHC, remember we talked about the CLP annex that was being used earlier. Here they use they use the candidate list in Article 5910 of the EC regulation for REACH. So if you're familiar with the REACH regulation there, and it talks about the candidate list of VHCs or SVHCs, they use the same list. Again, they realized they didn't have all the knowledge to create their own list. And maybe they even said, why should we? Because it already exists under REACH. So they just brought that into the regulation itself. Okay. Manufacturer, this is a question we get a lot of times and not just specific to the Middle East. Any natural or legal person established within the GCC. When they talk about a natural or legal person, that person can be a legal entity. So it could be a distributor, for example. You could have a single person who distributes your product in the GCC. That could be person. They're a citizen of Bahrain, therefore they are a natural or legal person, so they could be considered to be a manufacturer. Same with the importer there. Or it could be a legal entity. You could create a legal entity in, again, Bahrain, for example, and that would meet the terms of your manufacturer or your importer. Import means the physical introduction into the customs territory. So again, most people say, well, what does it mean if I import? What if I bring it into a warehouse, but I don't bring it directly to a customer, and I warehouse it somewhere and I wait, then I transload it to somewhere else? Importer, according to the GSO standard, means import into the physical customs territory. So if you bring it in and it sits in a warehouse for a year, for whatever reason, that is still considered import, even though it doesn't leave the warehouse. Same thing with import. It's synonymous with placing on the market. So you bring it into a warehouse, you have the ability, as you see here, to make it available to a third party. But again, for whatever reason, you choose not to for some period, that is considered placing on the market. So I highlight these because their definitions are a little bit different than we're used to seeing. And I don't want, again, remember I talked about permits and licenses, and you say, well, I'm okay, but maybe you're not because you didn't get a permit or a license. Same thing here. You may say, well, I'm not an importer. I'm not placing it on the market. According to their unusual definitions of those terms, you may very well be. Question here, for imports into GCC countries, for example, from the US, would the GCC accept safety data sheets and labeled prepared by the export country, for example, the US? That's an interesting question because remember the GCC regulation is not binding now. The member states have to put it into their law. So as of right now, yes, they would accept that because it's classified according to, in your example, leaving the US, so US GHS. Now, once those regulations get put into place in those member states, then they likely will not, or they will also require a GHS formatted safety data sheet and product label in the way the member state has chosen to implement it. Because, I know I keep coming back to this, but I want to make sure you really understand it. The regulation is not enforced in any of those member states right now, even though it's been published. So it is almost as if it doesn't exist because they haven't implemented it. Now, once they do, and they can say, okay, in our national law, remember Oman Regulation 123 of 2022, now we have a GHS standard in place, then you'll need to go ahead and follow it. Talking about HAZCOM, specifically about SCSs and labels, getting into the actual meat of the regulation, what is really required in the regulation. One of the things that you notice when you read the regulation is they keep coming back to a stated goal of the regulation, that the standard should be something that is easy for the average person, which is the language they use, to understand. The intended audience can easily understand. They go out of their way, I think, to say in a positive way that they don't want this regulation to be very technical, very confusing. They want people to get value out of it who are working with the chemicals or purchasing the chemicals. So, for example, they give you 3 specific principles that they want you to keep in mind or take into account when you're preparing your SDSs and labels. So you see here letters A, B, and C. So information should be conveyed in more than one way. Well, you might be required to have a pictogram that says this is a corrosive liquid, but the regulation says, well, you should do it in more than one way. So one way you could do that is have a warning statement also. You could say this product is corrosive to eyes or corrosive to skin or whatever. You can say it in words, not just say, well, everybody who knows GHS knows that pictogram means this. They want to give very specific areas where people can understand it in more than one way. Comprehensibility of the system component. Yeah, I put this there because it's very confusing language that they have in the standard. Comprehensibility of components of the system should take into account. It's how they've published it in their official English translation. But what I think that means is the overall goal should be what we just touched on, is the labels and the SDS should bring value to the customers. That if when you're questioning, should I do this or should I do that, I think that language is saying, well, what the authority would like you to do is make it more clear to people than possibly less clear whenever possible. And then talking about here, phrases that they use to indicate degree of severity should be consistent across different hazard types. So if you have a, again, this product is a corrosive liquid and you have the GHS pictogram that goes with that, they're saying it should be consistent across different hazard types. So when you go to another one that is corrosive in a different way, to skin, to eyes, whatever the different corrosivity is, you should still, to their language, have the pictogram used. You shouldn't be, well, okay, here's a pictogram and here's a phrase. Now, earlier we said they want you to over communicate, so you can have the pictogram and a phrase, but it shouldn't be one aspect here and a different aspect over here. They should be complementary. They should go, again, to making more clear to people rather than less clear what the hazards of the product are. Safety data sheet gives, section 4.1 gives you specific information about that. One of the things they note in there, and it's pretty much common knowledge in other GHS standards and other safety data sheet standards around the world, but they specifically, again, talk about it in the regulation, in the GCC standard. They note that there may be specific requirements that require training in addition to providing a safety data sheet. Now, for a lot of us working in Europe or Asia Pacific or the United States, we do that anyway. We give a safety data sheet, but sometimes we'll have a salesperson come out and say, well, this is a new product you've never purchased before. Here's your safety data sheet, but let me, the salesperson, do some training on that for you, on this product for you. And I know I've been with a lot of global companies, and we have absolutely done that because, again, just communicating additional knowledge. And that's something we did, again, to be good corporate citizens and so on. But here in the regulation, it says specifically that you may need other areas to provide the information, such as workplace training. So don't think, well, I don't have to if I don't want to. Here is something they really want you to consider, again, giving information to the population. And then whenever the GHS talks about competent authorities that may require additional information, it, again, adopts industry best practices and it adopts information from REACH. So when the text says, well, you may need additional information in order to more fully understand this, the authority, the GSO standard has said, here are some of the places you can go. You can go to industry best practice. So, for example, if the, well, it doesn't apply to pharmaceutical. If there's, if Cefic, for example, in Europe, has an industry best practice that they use and they share among their members, this regulation is saying, well, if you need additional information, for example, Cefic is a good place to go. Or the ACC, the American Chemistry Council in the United States, is a good place to go. But if you have other questions about classification and so on, you should go take a look at the REACH regulation, because that will we feel will give you additional good information as well. I know this is a lot of words, but again, we try to give an overview and then give you the ability to go back later and read through and get a more deep understanding of things. So talking about scope and applicability, here it talks about, when it meets criteria for being a hazardous substance, you have to give them a safety data sheet and it has to be free of charge and all these other things that you see here. But again, the bold language as we go through is my information, what I'm highlighting for you specifically. Here under scope and applicability, the provision of a safety data sheet is a mandatory requirement for all the suppliers, producers, and so on. No product shall be accepted or used without the availability of the current and valid SDS. And I highlight that because you go back a little bit where it says, well, for example, you don't necessarily have to provide one if it's not a hazardous substance according to the regulation. They say that. We've looked at that before. But then you go into 4.1.1.1 and it says, well, provision of an SDS is a mandatory requirement. It doesn't say, well, only if it's hazardous. It says, well, you know how we told you only if it's hazardous? Now we're changing that. Now we're saying it has to be for all substances. So again, going back maybe to Paul's question about, overwarning or so on, maybe that's what they're trying to do here, saying you basically have to give a data sheet no matter what. Again, just being able to give that information to the customer, to the consumer, so they have more information rather than less information. Worksheet, where exposure. So the safety data sheet where a mixture does not meet the criteria for dangerous. So the mixture itself is not considered to be dangerous. And as we saw a moment ago, doesn't require a safety data sheet, but then does require a safety data sheet right here. So if the mixture is not considered dangerous as in a classification point of view, but it contains a substance or substances where there are worker exposure limits, either by a recognized regulatory authority. So again, notice bold is my language that I'm calling your attention to. It talks about a recognized regulatory authority, but it doesn't name them. So it could be the Saudi Arabian Standards Organization, SASO. It could be the EU under REACH. It could be the US under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. So in the US, the workplace exposure would be under OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. But if there are exposure limits established by some other entity for something that's in the mixture product, you must provide the recipient with a safety data sheet. So you can say, again, well, the product doesn't meet the definition of hazardous, so I don't need a safety data sheet there. We see now that's not the correct understanding. You say, well, the product is not required to be classified as dangerous because of whatever, but there is a component in there, or there are components in the product that individually are classified as hazardous or dangerous or whatever it might be. Then you need to provide a safety data sheet for the product. And I say that to say, one, to make sure you're aware of your requirements, but B, as you get more into it with your Middle Eastern customers or suppliers who are familiar with the regulation, they're going to say, well, why are you giving me this? I don't need this. Your product says it's not hazardous. And you can say, well, here are the reasons why we're giving it to you, if you want to take that extra step and explain the regulation to them. Because again, on its face, not hazardous, don't need to do anything. We see again and again, that's not truly the case with the regulation. The question that we always get, doesn't matter what country it is what languages do they accept? 4.1.1.2 specifically talks about, first of all, something we've seen many times before here, how it should be simple language. You should try to avoid jargon. Jargon is a slang word, at least in English, that means words that everybody in the industry knows, but if you're outside the industry, you probably don't know. So for example, tox data is jargon if you're not a native English speaker, because it means toxicology data, and everybody in industry just shortens it and says tox data. So you have that information as shorthand, but outside the industry, people may not know that. So I want you to avoid things like that. In the GCC countries, again, this is according to the regulation. I know I keep saying it, but I want you to make sure you fully understand when it goes into the individual country's national law, this may change. But as it's written right now, the data sheet should be written in Arabic and English, and the supplier should provide the recipient with an SDS in both languages. And I didn't highlight it, I probably should have. The versions of the two SDSs should match. So if we break that apart real quickly, it means for those countries, you have to have the safety data sheet in Arabic, and you have to have it in English. And you see shall provide in both, with a safety data sheet in both languages. And then the versions of the two SDSs should match. So I think the language is a little confusing there, but I take that to say you need to give them an Arabic safety data sheet, and you need to give them a separate English safety data sheet. Because to me, the language is confusing a little bit, and I would defer to, or not defer to, I would go back to what Paul said about overwarning. I would say, well, here's a complete Arabic safety data sheet. So if somebody doesn't speak English, they have the data sheet completely in their native language. Here's the English safety data sheet if maybe you don't speak Arabic. Then specifically, the versions of the two SDSs shall match. So what is different on the Arabic should not, what is on the Arabic safety data sheet should not be different than what's on the English safety data sheet. And again, to a lot of people, that's common sense. We would get the English translated, but again, there are nuances with language and so on that you want to make sure that they match the two versions in terms of the warnings and the hazards and so on. Layout and length, this is a question we always get. How long does it need to be? You see the first sentence there? The length of the safety data sheet is not fixed. There's not a specific requirement for how long the data sheet needs. Now, when they talk about the data sheet, though, there's not a length fixed, but you see the other things that are required. All pages of the data sheet should be clearly numbered. So while there's not a fixed number of pages, you have to number each individual sheet. The date of the issue should be stated, so you have to have an issue date on your data sheet, and it has to be easily readable. So again, there's no definition really of what's easily readable, but I take that as mean you can't, put it in very small type in the bottom corner of your regulation, and maybe people would miss it. That's my interpretation. We haven't actually gone to the authority yet because the question hasn't come up, but that's how I would take it. Also, when the SDS has been revised, you should have the phrase revision and the date, and well as a version number. So you can't just say revised on the 8th of June, 2022. You have to give the number. So for example, if it was revising the original, you could say, okay, well, this is version 1, as well as providing the revision date. So there's traceability there. Numbers and units of quantities, stuff we're all familiar with, but it also says specifically in units appropriate to GCC countries. Now, everything we've seen in the GCC, they talk about, metric. They don't use imperial. So we've not seen any unit appropriate to the GCC countries. But again, when it goes into national law, they could say, for example, they want to use a different unit in this member state, and you would have to make sure it complies with that regulations. Another thing too, we talked about the revision date and the version date. Here specifically, it says when you make a revision to the safety data sheet, you have to indicate where the change has been made to the previous version. You do it here, you say either in section 16 or section by section. So for example, you can't just say, well, it's revision 1 and here's the date. You have to say either in the section or in section 16, the last section, here are the changes we made. We no longer call it, acute category 1. We now call it acute category 2. You have to say what that change is. And again, it's talking about over communication, making sure people can understand what the regulation or the SDS change is. Updating the SDS, just real quickly, it's the same as we're used to seeing when you get new information available. But the regulation specifically says if the SDS is updated, the new version has to go to all former recipients that have gotten product within the previous 12 months. So you have to have traceability to who has gotten the safety data sheet. And if there's an update, you have to make sure that if they've purchased within the last 12 months, that they get a copy of that updated data sheet. Again, coming from industry, you can't just say, well, it's available on our website. You have to affirmatively give them a copy of the revised safety data sheet. And then also, again, when you do your revision, you have to do a revision according to the GSO regulation at least every 3 years from the date of the original preparation. So if you created SDS today, at least every 3 years from today, you have to go through and say, do I need to revise this data sheet? You can't just say, well, I haven't had a chance to look at it. Stuff probably didn't change. You have to go ahead and actively do a revision or do a review of that safety data sheet. We have Paul. Paul, you got a lot of good questions. That's really good. Standard business process for them includes doing the English SDS for that region, as we assure the generators know what has been presented in the required language. That's fine. You can certainly do that. I mean, that's a lot of people say, well, in South America, for example, well, can I send them a US GHS safety data sheet? Depending on the country. In Brazil, absolutely not. In Argentina, absolutely not. In Chile, absolutely not. Mexico, absolutely not. But other countries that don't have GHS regulations in place, they would rather have you provide that information in English and sometimes in Spanish, but they will accept English, generally speaking, unless there's a regulation in place. CBI, this is a question we get all the time, and I want to make sure we cover it, even though we're running a little bit long. The CBI claims on your safety data sheet and on your product label should be limited to the chemical identity of certain substances. So I want you to focus on that. When it talks about what can be considered CBI, limited to the chemical identity of certain substances. That means, from our interpretation, substances can be claimed as CBI, confidential business information, but you can't claim everything on your product label or your product SDS as confidential business information. Because again, going back to one of the main goals of this product or this GSO standard is to communicate hazards clearly and often to people. So if you say, well, everything is protected as CBI, their point of view is that doesn't help the company or the customer or whomever understand the hazards of the regulation. Because all you've said is, well, there's some stuff in there and we're not going to tell you what it is. That doesn't help them get a sense of how to manage the product safely. If you use a TS, which that they don't define in the regulation, oh, I'm sorry, they do, trade secret. If you use a trade secret name for a component and that trade secret name has an OEL, an occupational exposure limit associated with. So what you're doing is you're saying methyl isothiazolone has an occupational exposure limit, at least in the United States and certainly in Europe. So if you're going to give a trade secret name on your data sheet, you're not going to show that it's MIT by name on your data sheet. You have to have in section 7 a statement that says, well, if you have other questions, here is who you contact in customer service, a specific competent authority for that information. You can't just say, well, it's trade secret and we're calling it X, component X. You have to say, well, if you have specific questions about component X or anything that's considered a trade secret, you need to be able to contact this customer information service. So your company does need to have a contact number on your safety data sheet. Those who author your safety data sheets, we won't go into it deeply because of the time constraints, but I want to show you specifically, you have to make sure you have what they call in the regulation a competent person who has adequate training or appropriate training on how to write an SDS. And you should, as the supplier, have some sort of program that will train your authors, refresh their training and refresh their knowledge on a regular basis. It doesn't say how often. It just says you have to have a program in place that if you were to be audited, for example, by whoever the competent authority turns out to be, you can say, look, I have a program that says every 6 months, every 2 years, I will give refresher training on how to prepare a safety data sheet. That's something the regulation requires you to have. Safety data sheet format comment, won't go there other than, interestingly, it specifically says in section 16 of the safety data sheet, the regulation says specifically that you may include the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association diamond. It's a red, white, and blue, and gray or yellow, depending diamond, that's really only used in the United States. And it's actually, since GHS, it's gone, I think, kind of by the wayside because those hazards that it talks about, flammability, reactivity, corrosivity, they're covered elsewhere in the GHS regulation in the United States. So I thought it was interesting to say, well, you know, this regulation that is only in the United States, it specifically says if you want to include that, you can. I don't understand the purpose, but they say if you want to, please be our guest to do that. Labels, just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're not going to go into detail. You can certainly go back and read the specific requirements. The translation of Arabic GHS regulations is the one provided in the GHS text. So when you go to the GHS text and it talks about, here's how you say in Arabic, corrosive liquid or corrosivity class 2 or whatever it might be, the Arabic statement in there is the one you must use. We saw this when we did the Chile training a couple months ago. Chile says in the regulation, here it is in Spanish, and you must use this language. You can't say, well, I got a local person who could translate it from English. This is what you must use. They say the same thing here. The Arabic translation that's provided in the regulation in 2654, you must follow that. You don't have the freedom, so to speak, to have your local person translate it. And then just format and size, just must use the appropriate size and spacing to be easily read. So again, over communicating, you want to make sure it's easily available to be read. They get very specific. They talk about the hazard pictogram must cover at least 1/15 of the minimum surface area of your label. So if you're creating a product label and for whatever reason your product label, your GHS pictogram can only cover 1/10 because your label is so complicated or whatever it might be, according to the regulation, that is not permitted. Now, when push comes to shove, will they actually go out and measure the surface area of your label and the surface area of that? I don't know. All I can tell you is right now, that's what's in the regulation specifically. Same requirements for updating your labels and for CBI and training of responsible people. Same regulations apply for labels as it does for safety data sheets. GHS labeling, we talked about it a moment ago when we talked about the Arabic phrases that must be used. Also with labeling, there's a table of mandatory GHS information put forth in the regulation, and that is in Arabic. So again, use that language. Don't create your own language as you go through. And the stuff hazard classification, we won't go in right now because we're running low on time, but gives you information about mixtures and bridging and so on. If that involves you, what you can do and what you cannot do. Same thing with concentration limits. There are specific ones now. There are specific concentration limits and generic concentration limits. You can read in section 5.2.1 of the standard, find out what the difference is and when you need to do those, but it includes 2 specific types, not just one specific type. Physical hazards, it gives you information in the standard. Health hazards gives you information in the standard. And environmental hazards, it gives you information in the standard, specifically what those classifications need to be. Excuse me. We talked again about harmonized classification and labeling. It does adopt the CLP regulation. We saw that again, but here's in the regulation specifically where it talks about doing that. Hazard classification, and I know it was 8 is appendix, but it's actually hazard communication. It's not really an appendix. It's part of the standard. Now, 8 lists all the safety data sheet and label standards that are still active in the GCC, broken down by country. And what I talked about earlier, I said in an example in Saudi Arabia, there are 2 countries, 2 cities specifically that have their own chemical substance regulation and their own classification and their own labeling and their own inventory requirements. You see right here, Yanbu and Jubail are the 2 countries that I was alluding to. So they have, for example, Royal Commission environmental regulations. So those are applicable as part of the hazard communication standard. And you're saying, well, why would that apply to Oman, for example? They don't have, they're not Saudi Arabia and they don't have those cities with those requirements in place. Appendix 8 says essentially, we don't care. That's considered to be something that you need to focus on and take a look at. So here they are as well for the others. Some key takeaways, our last slide. One of the things I want you to focus on specifically is, and again, I know I've said it many, many times, you're probably you're sick of hearing me say it, but it's important to know that this is not required to be mandatory. It most likely will. We've seen many, many other GCC standards that have been brought into place and been made mandatory, but it's not required to be, and it does take time. The standard references REACH and CLP, but there are differences in certain places. We skimmed over that because of time, but go back and read those slides because it says, well, REACH is not totally applicable here, and REACH is not, or CLP is not totally applicable over here. Make sure you understand which they go ahead and tend to focus on or do focus on. Training, we spent a little bit of time on this. Training is required specifically by the standard, but it doesn't say what kind of training you need to do and how often you need to do it. It says you need to revise your label or review your label every 3 years, but you could do training every 30 days if you wanted to. If you have a lot of new people coming in, you could do training you probably wouldn't want to do 5 years because you have the review standard of 3 years, but you could do it every 3 years if you chose to. There's no requirement for time or frequency as long as you go ahead and do that standard, that training. One of the things we saw, again, there are specific requirements about the pictogram size on the label, and it depends on your label size. So it has to be that 1/15. If you have a bigger label, your pictogram has to be bigger. If you have a small label, it will have to be smaller, but there is still that 1/15 of the label size aspect to be aware of. And then we didn't touch on this, but again, go back to the slide that talks about labeling. There are specific statements that you can take off your label in certain circumstances. It's not just, well, you don't need these at all. It's in certain circumstances, if the label is too small, for example, the standard will let you take certain language off if you choose to, but it has to meet the specific circumstances and the certain criteria. And then just going through the questions, we have one more. Does each label have to be bilingual or two separate labels? Again, we haven't had guidance either way. I would say, to be fully clear, what if you were asking me as a consultant role, I would say put both on there. This way, again, it's clearly readable in Arabic and it's clearly readable in English. You don't have one that has both languages on there, and maybe you're saying, well, it's a really small label and then I have to put twice the language on there and people have to look really closely to understand it. That might be compliant. We haven't asked, but I would say recommendation is just make two separate labels. You will not be penalized by the GCC, again, for overwarning or for putting extra information on there that they don't require. So go ahead and certainly take care of that in your aspects. And then finally, again, just reminding you, those of you who haven't been on the webinars before, all of the webinars we do once a quarter, are complimentary. You can sign up on the website. There's no charge for them. Again, we'll be doing South America regulatory updates in September of this year. A lot of changes in South America. As I said before, Chile has a national chemical inventory regulation in place. They have a GHS regulation in place. A lot of things are moving very quickly, so we'll do an update there. And then in November, we'll talk specifically about the cosmetic laws in the Middle East. Because remember, they're exempted from this GHS regulation, but they do have, each country has specific cosmetic laws that you need to follow in terms of labeling, active ingredients, purity, sourcing of raw materials, things like that. So make sure you go ahead and you're familiar with those as well. And again, you can join at any time you want. For the few people hanging on, any last minute questions? You can certainly answer those. And again, the recording will be on the website in about an hour or so once I upload it there, as well as the other presentations we've done. So if you want to look at Chile, you want to look at Israel's regulations, you want to look at other regulations we've done in the past, you can certainly do that as well. So thank you very much for attending, everyone.